Political pawns on a hijacked flight. Rosamund Pike stars in Entebbe in 45 minutes on BBC Two Wales after Newsnight with Mark Urban.
In this connection, I have taken the long-since overdue decision immediately to recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic.
Vladimir Putin makes his move and orders Russian troops into eastern Ukraine. In a televised address, President Putin says Ukraine is a danger to Russia and accuses them of wanting to acquire nuclear weapons. We'll ask what tonight's move means for Ukraine, Russia and the West. Also tonight, all COVID restrictions will end in England from Thursday. Is the government taking an acceptable risk? Good evening. Tonight, Vladimir Putin finally showed his hand and ordered troops in. It followed an hour-long TV address where he accused Ukraine of a litany of crimes, from oppressing Russian speakers to threatening the Orthodox Church and planning to acquire nuclear weapons. He added that Ukraine was holding a knife to Russia's throat. That sounded like a rationale for any scale of military action that he sees fit. What he did straight away was sign a decree recognising the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine as independent republics, Boris Johnson calling it a breach of international law. In a moment, we'll be speaking live to a US Congressman, Adam Smith, and the Ukrainian ambassador to London. But first, the Russian army has been given a peacekeeping mission, so-called, in East Ukraine. What to expect now? During the last 48 hours, many videos have appeared showing these troops. Now, if we stop this and look, you'll see that all the vehicles have a large Z applied in white paint. That's a recognition symbol for soldiers who may soon enter combat against an enemy equipped with similar vehicles. How far will they go? The Russian army has moved a big proportion of its combat power, 70% according to some estimates, to the area around Ukraine, about 125 battalion tactical groups. Up to 1,000 soldiers in each of those, plus supporting elements, taking them to around 175,000 soldiers. They're commanded by half a dozen higher headquarters in Crimea, bordering the separatist-held Donbass there, and just north, where a key concentration from the 1st Tank Army is centred, including those tanks we saw at the start, to Belarus. Russia now has many military options. It could send troops into breakaway Donetsk and Luhansk, as tonight's announcements suggest, or go further to batter the Ukrainian army. It could push beyond, and current dispositions suggest a double envelopment. Those two arms you see there from Crimea and the Belgorod area might be used to cut off much of eastern Ukraine. At the highest end of escalation would be the type of plan revealed by the UK Ministry of Defence last Friday, suggesting a drive to Kiev and indeed taking the whole of eastern Ukraine. Now, experts in Kiev doubt this. They feel that Russia's forces may be big, but there just aren't enough to occupy such a huge area or surround their capital, a city of 5 million. As for the trigger for this military action, President Putin hosted a public meeting of his Security Council today. There, he sounded the death knell for the Minsk Accords, the long-stalled peace process between Ukraine and the Russian separatists. And he delivered this a few hours later in a TV address.
Видим, что правящая в Киеве верхушка постоянно и публично заявляет о нежелании выполнять Минский комплекс мер по урегулированию конфликта. Не заинтересована в мирном решении. Напротив, пытается вновь организовать на Донбассе блицкриг, как это уже было в 2014 и 2015 годах. Чем закончились тогда эти авантюры, мы помним.
Well, what about the trigger for military intervention? There have been incidents in the Russian separatist areas that seem to be the very provocations that Western leaders warned about, from the alleged shelling of a border post in Russia. Ukraine says none of its artillery was within range, to this apparently graphic footage which claimed to show a man who'd lost his leg in Ukrainian shelling, but who some observers have pointed out appears to already have a fixing for a prosthesis. Extraordinary goings-on then as Russia tries to shape public opinion for action. So how will President Putin's speech be regarded by its audience in Russia? Earlier I spoke to Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Over a fragile internet connection, our apologies for that, I asked him whether tonight's speech was effectively a declaration of war.
Well, I wouldn't be that confident about that. And it's now up to the West to decide whether business as usual is still an option after this diplomatic recognition of the two breakaway republics in East Ukraine.
What would you say, listening to that speech, is his state of mind?
Well, first of all, I think that it is very personal. You know, he has some very strong personal feelings towards Ukraine. Clearly, it is a disappointment. There is a lot of resentment there. And I think that he tries very hard to justify the decision that he has just made. It's not easy, but he tries to be as convincing as he possibly can. This speech was addressed primarily to the domestic audience. And of course, many people in Russia feel sympathetic to those who live in the Donetsk and Lugansk areas of Ukraine. The general perception is that life is really hard for these people. They have to exist in the situation of permanent instability. So I think that if the decision made by Putin can bring more order and more peace to the region, this is something that the Russian public would definitely support. Though, of course, the Russian public is also concerned about the repercussions of this decision, namely about more Western sanctions, and the people are thinking about how these sanctions might affect their day-to-day lives.
Andrei, you said before that the measure was intended to bring peace to those areas of East Ukraine, but it did seem that President Putin, by talking, for example, of a Ukrainian desire to get nuclear weapons sooner or later, and that they were holding a knife to the throat of Russia, was using a language that could justify going all the way to Kiev. I mean, to change the government there.
Well, I can only hope that it will not happen, because it is relatively easy to put the Donetsk and Lugansk areas under control. The population there is predominantly pro-Russian. The leadership, of course, expects Russia to get involved. But if you move to Ukraine proper, if you move in the direction of Kiev or Kharkiv or West Ukraine, definitely you're likely to meet a lot of resistance. You cannot occupy all the country. Russia is not in a position to do that. Ukraine is relatively big by European standards. It's more than 40 million people. How can you possibly control such a country if it is not ready to accept your rule? So I frankly doubt very much that a large-scale military operation of Russia in Ukraine makes any sense. You can, in theory, you can think of a surgical strike, but no government imposed by Moscow would be regarded as legitimate in Ukraine. So I think that it would also boost anti-Russian feelings among the core Ukrainian population. And I hope that everybody in the Kremlin understands this reality quite clearly.
Andrei Kortunov, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So what now from both the West and Ukraine? Well, joining us in the studio are Congressman Adam Smith, Chairman of the US House of Representatives Armed Services Committee. Welcome. And Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko, who's just been on a teleconference with President Zelensky and Boris Johnson. I know you can't give us an exact readout of what was said, but what is President Zelensky's mood after this speech from Vladimir Putin tonight?
We just had a National Security and Defense Council. It's still ongoing. We just had a break and had the chance to talk to President Biden, both, and Prime Minister Johnson. I believe that as of now, what we are saying, what we are seeing, that's blatant violation of international rules, not just our integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And what we also see that this is a clear danger to our state, and incursion is already started. What I believe President asked both.
You think the Russian troops have already entered?
Yes, because what they signed today, that's already they will provide, the armed forces of Russia will provide security to this.
But you don't know that they've entered. Sorry, just to be specific about that point.
No, they are not entering as we speak.
Right.
But what Putin told his military forces to engage in providing and maintaining security of newly recognized, an hour ago recognized new republics, as he sees that.
Congressman Smith, I mean, we've seen in recent weeks President Biden's administration talking about sanctions, revealing certain aspects of the plan, the provocations, all these sort of things. Would you accept that whatever they were trying to deter hasn't really worked?
Well, to date, no, it has not. Putin's troops are still on the border. I mean, also, I will say to date, he has not actually invaded Ukraine. And we have to use the levers we have available. Big lever is showing that this is going to strengthen NATO, not weaken it, that these actions are going to get the opposite result of what Putin is looking for, and also to be unified on sanctions that are going to be imposed. And this decision to take away the structural integrity of a sovereign nation, that is a violation. Sanctions will now be imposed. The president has said as much. So, we need
on those two breakaway
republics. Just for doing that. I mean, that is the incursion that we said. It's clear. It is a clear violation of international law, and we should have no ambiguity about that, and we should hold them accountable for that decision, even as we also try to prevent, further unwarranted aggression.
Well, in terms of a possible further aggression, I have to say, hearing some of that language in the speech, if I was Ukrainian, I'd be worried. I mean, do you worry that this might be about going all the way to Kiev or taking large parts of your country? I
was also listening to what he was saying, almost an hour of these historic debates with himself. And I have to tell you, when the nuclear nation is calling your nation a historical mistake which has to be fixed, yes, you have to be worried what he has in mind.
Let's talk about sanctions in a little bit more depth. As you say, President Biden has announced an initial raft and is obviously going to be reviewing this by the hour, depending presumably on where Russian forces go. But this isn't the sort of big bazooka, is it, of cutting off foreign finance, for example, to the Russian economy, some of the things that have been talked about?
Yeah, that has not been decided yet. The president made a statement, announcement, and the clear thing is, anybody doing business with the two so-called breakaway republics will be cut off. So that's the focus of this. And also we're leaving options on the table to do more sanctions beyond that. But the big bazooka you refer to is basically to cut off Russian oligarchs and Russian business people from using the international financial system. Between the U.S. and Great Britain, we have the power to do that, and we are prepared to do that.
And if the Russian forces do enter, we don't absolutely know that they've gone into those self-declared republics, but if they do go in, do you think the US will continue to supply the kind of advanced weapons, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that they've done in recent weeks? Will they feed Ukrainian resistance to such a move?
Yes, absolutely. And we have to have a robust discussion, not just in the US. Remember, this is our allies. Obviously, this is working with the Ukrainian government. What weaponry they need, how quickly can we get it to them? Yes, we need to provide more weapons to help Ukraine defend itself.
And in those terms, I mean, we know the UK Prime Minister is going to chair a meeting of the Emergency Committee tomorrow. What would be on your list as Ukrainians in terms of what the UK could do? Already done a fair bit, but to help more.
Yes, you did, and the United States did. We have covered more or less the immediate threat of a tank incursion. We have now enough rockets to cover all the tanks which can cross our border. We have some troubles with sea and air. That's where our efforts are concentrating right now.
Do you think, when you hear some of the language that President Putin was using, I mean, obviously a deep-held set of grievances there, quite an emotional language, holding a knife to the throat of Russia. Does his state of mind cause you concern?
Yes, absolutely. There's been a lot written about it. He's been very isolated for the last 2 years. And the parade of having all these people come up and now let us hear what you think, which is basically, now please tell people what I told you to think. He does not seem to be getting any sort of advice other than what he wants to hear. And yes, it is very concerning that he has isolated himself in that way. The cost of doing this to Russia is going to be enormous. Just about every commentator, in fact, I heard we met with the Prime Minister Johnson earlier today with the Speaker of the House, and we were even talking about, why would Putin do this given the obvious downside for Russia? And I think you hit upon the answer. He's not getting good advice. He has isolated himself.
One of the things that President Biden, in common with President Obama and President Bush, have tried to do is refocus on Asia. To what extent does this drag the US back into Europe in a major way and, in a sense, guarantee something President Putin would like to be rid of, a continued substantial military presence in Europe?
Well, I think there's always been a bit of a misunderstanding about the whole pivot to Asia. The point was that when then President Obama was the first one to sort of announce that, we hadn't been paying enough attention to Asia. But I can tell you, as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, I've joked that we ought to have a mnemonic for China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, transnational terrorist threats. Okay, and you can rank them however you want to rank them. They're all on the list. They are all national security concerns, and Russia has never not been a national security concern in the last 10 years. So they're very much on the list, and we are not moving away from that. You saw that at the Munich Security Conference. The unity of the NATO partners and of the U.S. focused certainly on Ukraine, but also on the broader threat that Putin presents. He is a major factor in our national security plans.
I mean, the US was going down under President Obama to 0 tanks in Europe. So to an extent, in the years since then, it has reinforced its presence. Sure. Would you envisage further heavy forces being forward deployed in Poland, the Baltic republics, wherever?
Absolutely. As you know, I mean, President Putin's comments in 2007, which were the first indication that all of our... Look, we tried to work with Russia, not to subjugate them, but to integrate them into the world. Okay, we provided a lot of support. Putin chose a different path. And as he's continued down that path, we, our NATO partners, everyone has recognized with a growing threat requires a growing response.
Vadim Pristakov, can I ask you, you are also a former foreign minister of Ukraine, so I'm sure that diplomacy is in your DNA, as it were, but do you think everything that President Macron, Chancellor Scholz have been trying to do over recent weeks has been well judged? Some people say they've been played, that they've tried to put the Ukrainian government under a lot of pressure.
We have full respect to what both nations are doing, and not just now. They've been doing it all the almost 8 years, trying to resolve this issue, trying to, invest so much political capital of their own, a previous president, previous chancellor, so they did a fair share of what could be done. The result is what we see right now. What we try. So
it was futile.
At the end of the day, yes, they're still doing what they just killed Minsk agreement, which both nations brokered for us and with us. Now it's dead. All this normative format, all the meetings of the leaders in the Paris last one is dead. It's not for nothing.
Okay, so for viewers unfamiliar, this was a process started in 2014. The Germans and the French were co-guarantors of it. I mean, where do you see peacemaking? I mean, clearly there's going to be some very difficult weeks ahead, but in the end, there's presumably going to have to be some sort of forum for reconciling people in eastern Ukraine with the rest of the country, or not, do you think? Is that moment over?
No, I don't think that moment is over. I think it's very difficult. And the language that has been used is, if we're really going to get Putin to stop, what's the off-ramp? What is the credible way that we can uphold the integrity? Telling other nations what they can and cannot do is a non-starter. We can't accede to his notion of going back to the mid-90s. But is there an off-ramp? And that's what we are all we're trying to find that off-ramp that is acceptable. But we still have a lot of work, and diplomacy still must be used.
And how does President Zelensky now frame this to the Ukrainian people? What does he say? Does he order national mobilization? Does he keep going with his keep calm and don't panic message? I mean, what does he do in this situation?
He will go in a minute to national television. I understand as soon as the National Security Council is over this sitting, he will go and talk to nations. What we already have done, we try to reach out to those people in these separate republics, telling them, please come back home. Is it still time before Russian troops will be on this part in this area? Please come. We'll try to live and try to find a way, as the congressman just said.
And Congressman, in terms of the big picture, I mean, where this leaves us, the kind of message that what we think is now underway might give to the American public. I mean, what do you think of the fact that the person in charge of an arsenal of 6,000 nuclear weapons is, as you yourself said, isolated, cut off from good advice? I mean, how much should that worry the American public?
Well, it should worry the American public a lot. And, you know, I'm chairman of the Armed Services Committee, but I also represent 740,000 constituents. And you will typically hear people say, you know, they're focused on kitchen table issues, on getting out of COVID, on, you know, dealing with crime, on getting the economy going. I also have a very large Ukrainian population in my district as well. So they're very focused on this. But I think America is very focused on it because of that threat. You know, we can't walk away from it because not only is Russia a threat, the idea that you can do this opens it up to other autocrats, to Iran, to China. This is something that's important to the entire world, not just Ukraine.
Congressman, Ambassador, thank you both very much. Now, in the run-up to today's announcement by the Kremlin, NATO and European Union countries had said that an invasion by Russia would result in sanctions of unprecedented severity. Some argue that they should be applied now, since President Putin has recognised the separatist republics violating Ukraine's internationally recognised borders. Indeed, tonight, the UK and US have said sanctions are coming. As for those Western economic measures, the more they hurt, the more likely President Putin is to hit back, as he said tonight he could do, with new measures of his own. Our economics editor Ben Chu has been looking at how this might play out.
There has been a good deal of discussion of how the West could hurt Russia via sanctions and other economic penalties in response to an invasion of Ukraine. There's been less attention paid to the potential for action in the other direction. What could Vladimir Putin potentially do economically to hurt the West? In the past, Russia has barred imports of Western agricultural products in response to Western sanctions. But analysts don't see that as a significant source of leverage. Potentially more serious is a prohibition on exports of certain key raw materials. According to Reuters, the White House warned the US semiconductor chip industry to diversify its supply chain in case of Russian disruption to exports of neon and palladium from the region. Semiconductor factories use neon gas in lithography and palladium for chip packaging. According to the market research group TechSet, over 90% of US semiconductor-grade neon supplies came from Ukraine, and 35% of palladium used in the US is sourced from Russia.
It's really quite large. Every major chip manufacturer here knows that it's a potential problem. It's really, really bad right now. I can say before this Russia-Ukraine thing happened, we were getting multiple calls about shortages already happening in other areas.
Then there's ammonium nitrate used as fertilizer in agriculture. Russia represents around 2/3 of global production. Something curbs on these exports could push up global food prices. Added to that is the fact that Russia and Ukraine together exported around 1/4 of the world's wheat, with a large share going to US allies, Egypt and Turkey. But the really big potential source of economic leverage for Russia is energy exports. 40% of the EU's gas came from Russia in 2020 and 25% of its oil. In Germany, the share of total gas consumption coming from Russia is around half.
A very dramatic cutoff, an overt one that could not be explained by anything other than an act of economic warfare, would be disastrous. That means no heating your homes. It means running your business potentially at greater cost or not at all, because producing at a loss is sometimes a reason to shut down entirely. For manufacturing intensive industry in particular, and those that are reliant on gas to back up electric power generation from renewables, it is also not really an option to shut down. So it means high prices that get passed through to end users.
Cutting off energy supplies would create an energy crisis overnight for Europe, including the UK. Although it should be noted that this would likely be the very last option for Putin, given energy is responsible for more than 60% of Russia's total exports and accounts for some 30% of its economy. Short of a full energy embargo, the ability of the West and Russia to impose economic harm on each other is asymmetric. The West can almost certainly impose more pain on Russia than vice versa. Western firms can more easily diversify away from Russian raw material imports. But that really doesn't mean that Russia can't impose any economic harm. And there are other unofficial levers that Moscow could pull, of course, including cyber attacks on Western targets. Russian military hackers were identified as being responsible for cyber attacks on Ukrainian banks and government websites last week. The lesson of history is that there have been lots of asymmetric battlefields, economic and otherwise, but battle has been joined nonetheless.
Ben Chu there. Well, to discuss the possible levers of influence over Russian behaviour, we're joined by Svetlana Zalishchuk, who is a former Ukrainian politician and human rights activist. Welcome to Newsnight, Svetlana. When you hear Western leaders talking about immediate sanctions because of President Putin's signature on this declaration tonight, recognising these two breakaway republics, what sort of things are you expecting?
The middle part.
I think that, first of all, price of not invasion, however big it is anyway smaller than price of Putin's further invasion into Ukraine. And I think that sanctions are exactly those measurements or those leverages in hands of the collective West to make sure that Putin doesn't go further. You know, I came just from the Munich Security Conference, and the authors of the report of this conference came up with this term, collective helplessness, which describes the inertia of the international community to react at the crises that we face in the recent years. So the opposite formula of this collective helplessness would be act now. And, you know, in my mind, the actions of the West should be based on moral ground, not even on NATO membership. It's irreconcilable that decision-making with regards to the prevention of the war in the heart of Europe will be limited by this principle of belonging to some alliance. You will not be able to explain to your children, why didn't you do everything possible to prevent killing of thousands or, I don't know, dozens of thousands, hundreds of thousands people. Of course, sorry, just one more thing I want to say. Of course, rules, this is something that we have to be directed by. But first of all, it's human values.
But do you think that that will is there? Because we see already tonight as the US, UK and EU respond to these moves by President Putin, people scrutinising them, saying, OK, so the EU is only talking about sanctioning leaders or officials connected with this recognition of the breakaway of these two independent republics. US saying something slightly different, sanctioning people and enterprises within those two breakaway republics. It's not the big raft of measures yet, is it? It's a sort of discriminating form of sanctions.
Yes, it's a very good question. What would be the trigger for a bigger package of sanctions, and what kind of sanctions will it take? What is the threshold so that Putin is really scared to move forward? Anyway, we understand that this is violation of the international law and Minsk agreement, and it is the next decree of the escalation of the situation. But even more important question is whether it's a culmination in Putin's scenario or just another dramatic chapter in a tragedy that unfolds before our eyes. And we can't let him be director of our history.
Do you think, though, that if Russia moves further beyond the boundaries of these rebel-held areas, that there will be the will to follow through with harsher sanctions on the part of Western countries?
You know, once again, I just came from the Munich Security Conference, and I felt it that there is unity as never before, and the bond between NATO members is very strong. And I think that we have to thank it to Mr. Putin in this case.
Now, I'd like to... Sorry to jump in, because I'd like to bring in Nina Khrushcheva, who is the Professor of International Affairs and is, by the way, a great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, the former Russian leader, Soviet leader, I should say. Welcome to Newsnight, and I'm sorry we couldn't get you up at the beginning of this discussion. There clearly are going to be sanctions now, but in a sense, they're going to be limited. That's what we've deduced so far, to the breakaway republics or officials connected with them. Do you think that's the right approach?
Well, thank you. I actually think that they are going to be maybe limited. Today they were announced to be limited, but I think it's, you know, the sky is the limit. And And there will be more and more, and there will be more conversation between the US and its allies and the countries in Europe. So I would imagine that the sovereign debt would be sanctioned. I would imagine maybe not first the larger banks, but smaller banks still will be sanctioned. Perhaps the Aeroflot airline will have some restrictions and so on. So I think the problems are coming. I think that this is only the beginning. And if Putin stops at those republics, that maybe it's not going to go further. But I would imagine, because they already announced that they're sending the troops to keep the peace. So in some ways, it is already that invasion.
Right.
Even if it's an incursion, let's say it's an incursion, not invasion, but incursion is big enough. It's a problem enough.
But Mr. Putin has also said tonight that he will hit back if sanctions start to hurt, I guess, is the implication of what he was saying. And he's got lots of options, as we were hearing from Ben Chu, from Key Minerals. He could stop overflights, couldn't he? If the US bans Aeroflot, he could say you can't fly to the Far East over Russia. There's all sorts of things he could do. Do you think we could be in for a spiral, an escalation in terms of sanctions?
I think so. I think we could be. I think the diplomatic relationship with more countries would be hurt. I think there's still a lot of gas possibilities to, when would Europe find other sources of gas? I mean, thank God now it's spring, it's going to be summer, so there is some time, but not enough time. So certainly, and that's why I believe Putin decided to do what he's done, because at the Security Council, the Russian Security Council meeting, they've been discussing how in 2008, when there was a incursion into Georgia, the breakaway republic, the South Ossetia Republic, that the Russians defended. At that time, well, there were sanctions. I mean, there were no sanctions, but there was conversation, and then everybody calmed down, so to speak. I think they're waiting for the same lukewarm response, especially from Europe. But I don't believe, I think they're miscalculating. I think now Europe and America are much stronger united than they were then.
Thank you, Nina Khrushcheva and Svetlana Zalishchuk. Thank you both indeed very much for joining us on Newsnight. Now, while we've been watching the Ukraine crisis unfolding, the COVID restrictions that have dominated life for much of the past 2 years have been eased across most of Europe, or much of Europe. Today, the Prime Minister announced the end to all COVID restrictions in England. From Thursday, even those who've tested positive for the virus will no longer be obliged to isolate, and routine contact tracing will end too. Sir Keir Starmer said that when the government talks about living with COVID, it means ignoring it. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
Simple, though highly expensive. Mass testing, which became a way of life. Soon to end as we say goodbye to the last set of COVID restrictions, which once saw most of us confined to our homes. Boris Johnson announced a new plan to live with COVID, which in England will see the end from this Thursday of the legal requirement to self-isolate after a positive test, though people will still be advised to do this until the 1st of April. There will also be an end to routine contact tracing. The free mass testing of symptomatic and asymptomatic people will end from the 1st of April. The test will remain free for the elderly and the vulnerable. But the ONS testing survey of the wider population will continue with the aim of tracking the virus amid warnings that future variants could be more lethal.
Mr. Speaker, COVID will not suddenly disappear.
Caution from the Prime Minister, who highlighted further vaccinations of the elderly and vulnerable. But a hailing of how the vaccine programme has allowed England to open up earlier than other similar countries.
Mr. Speaker, it is time that we got our confidence back. We don't need laws to compel people to be considerate to others. We can rely on that sense of responsibility towards one another.
But the government's chief scientists were keen to emphasise the risks.
We all expect, and Patrick will talk more about this, there to be new variants. And some of those new variants will just disappear, but some of them will cause us significant problems, and they could be either more vaccine escaping, or it could be more intrinsically severe, because Omicron came from a much earlier variant. So we could certainly end up with something which is more likely to lead to hospitalizations.
These measures are going to be important to give the safety net. And as an American colleague put it at the weekend, he said, you can celebrate when the sun's shining, but take your umbrella with you.
Don't see that as a sign of division, said the Prime Minister.
I don't want you to think that there's some, division between the gung-ho politicians and the cautious, anxious scientists, much though it may suit everybody to say so.
A familiar set of characters at the podium, and today, no mistaking a difference in approach. Yes, the Prime Minister was cautious at times, and yes, the scientists spoke crucially of a phased lifting of restrictions, but the differences in their hearts were plain to see. Let's move on, thinks the Prime Minister. Let's be cautious, warn the scientists. Labour was critical of the Prime Minister's announcement.
First of all, it was utterly absurd to hear Boris Johnson lecturing the country about personal responsibility. What next? Vladimir Putin lecturing us on world peace? I mean, give me a break. I think more seriously and substantially, though, the big problem with the Prime Minister's announcement was the removal of free testing from the 1st of April. Because it's all very well telling the country to show personal responsibility, and I think most people do show personal responsibility. But how can people do the right thing if they don't know their status?
Conservative critics of COVID restrictions welcomed the changes.
I'll take the Prime Minister's statement, if I may, as his application to join the COVID recovery group. He's very welcome indeed. I only wish it had been sooner.
The road back to some form of normality, all looking in the same place, but often seeing different outcomes.
Nick, what there? Well, to discuss this, we're joined by Peter Openshaw, who is Professor of Experimental Medicine at Imperial College and a member of the Committee on Respiratory Diseases, but speaking tonight in a personal capacity. Professor, look, nobody likes these restrictions. A lot of people aren't following them anyway now. Is it over?
No, it's certainly not over. I mean, I think none of us like these restrictions, myself included. And I'm not a great fan of legally enforced restrictions. I think, people need to know what it is that they can do to protect themselves and protect others. And generally, people do the right thing. And I think a lot of people are doing the right thing at the moment. What's most important is that they don't get the message that it's over and we can all throw away our masks and start behaving as if COVID doesn't exist.
Do you think, or do you worry, that politicians might be forcing the pace here on the science?
Well, I think there is a difference between what the scientific advice would be and what the government is doing. And that's really a political decision that they've made, that at the moment it's important to ease restrictions and also to reduce the financial burden. But that's not for scientific reasons. It's really for political reasons and economic reasons.
Listening today to Chris Whitty, he said, we need to be very careful. Is this a careful approach, do you think?
Well, I absolutely agree with Chris Whitty. We need to be very careful. I mean, we've still got something like 3 million people infected in this country. There's a fair chance if you're out on public transport or in a crowded, stuffy area that there will be people close to you who are infected and who potentially might be transmitting the virus to you. I think all of us know what we can do to reduce transmission, which is wear a mask and keep your distance and not breathe stuffy air that's been exhaled by others. And, we need to keep doing that. I don't think that Boris Johnson or any of the other politicians are intending us to just ignore COVID and pretend it's not happening.
Do you think, because there was some reporting in the run-up to today's announcements, that suggested almost that the whole system of surveillance, of survey testing and all these other things that might be used to spot a new variant would be rolled back. But it doesn't quite look that way, does it? So what still remains in place as the early warning system that this might be coming back as a big problem?
It's absolutely vital that we retain that early warning system through the Office for National Statistics, but also through the big studies like like Siren and React. These are big surveillance studies which are relatively cheap to run, actually, but which tell us how much virus there is out there, where it is, and which strains. These are the ways in which we can get early warning of new variants, and we are pretty confident that there will be new variants, and there's no guarantee that they're going to be as mild as Omicron appears mostly to be.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because over the past year or two, we've seen all sorts of amateur virologists giving their view that, they all tend to become less lethal, less debilitating over time. Is that a safe bet that Omicron shows the way towards?
I'm afraid it's not a safe bet. I mean, there's been long discussion amongst the virologists about whether there is any natural reason that with repeated iterations and evolution of the virus that it will become more mild. That there is no necessity for that at all. The virus is being driven by transmissibility and to some extent now from escape from immune pressure, but it's not driven by becoming more mild or less lethal.
I mean, let's try to hope and be optimistic that we won't be back into full-scale lockdowns and the like. 2 years of this, looking now, we hope, in the rearview mirror. What sort of report card would you give the government in the way it responded to this extraordinary challenge?
Well, I think it's been remarkable, actually, to see vaccines being produced and rolled out at scale, where we didn't really think that vaccines were necessarily going to be produced in time. That's been a remarkable thing to watch that happen. I think the other thing which we can be really proud about is that we've done wonderful trials very fast within the NHS that have led the way in terms of what we can use to treat the people who are infected, with the steroids and with the immune modulators and now, with the antivirals which are coming on stream. All of this is quite revolutionary and will change the way in which we treat not only COVID-19 but also other viral diseases in the future.
Well, on that hopeful note, Professor Openshaw, thank you very much. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. We'll be back tomorrow. Do tune in. But from all of us on the team, good night.
Hello there. A ridge of high pressure built in behind Storm Franklin later on a Monday. It's settled.